So I'm Keith Wilson. Bonnie Wilson's my wife. My oldest son, Carl, he works in the business. He actually runs the business. I'm the maintenance man now, these days. So then there was Mary Wilson and Clara and Carl Wilson and Ethel that run the business. And then now Carl's running it, and with his help from his better half, Carla, and he has 3 children, and they're involved all the time. So Agnes Wilson was one of the girls in 1855. She was like in her early 20s, and she wasn't married. So can you imagine the conversation she was having with her parents at the dinner table? She didn't have any kids, and she wasn't married, and she's 20-some years old, and she's telling them that I'm going to start a fishing business. And they'd be saying, hold her, you should have at least 5 kids by now. At this age, you need to be married. So anyway, she ran the business in the headwaters of the river. And she operated out of the old Wilson place in Bloomfield Bridge. And that old house stood there until just a number of years ago. I'm not sure what year it was, but just until recent history. And so when she died in 1920, about, my great-grandfather, Willard, was located at the original homestead. So we're immigrants from Scotland in 1803. So he was running a grocery store and lumber mill and, doing all the stuff you do in them days, horses and woodwork and everything. And he said, well, I'll just take over the business. And then it continued on. To me, so the big change, that was a big change in the family history, and he took it over. And then the next big change was when I relocated the business to Big Murphy. Once Willard took over in the 20s, then the Wilson homestead was a boarding house for people traveling, and there was a train station there, and a post office, and all that stuff. So then they started building cottages, and we have pictures in the lodge here of the little cottages on the front lawn, just these little tiny dingles, little huts, and then they built cottages across the road. And there's one of them still there today. We still use it as a guides camp, just for an overflow for guides. But all the little cottages were built there, and they operated out of that. So then we used to have private water from Boys Town to Amos-town, and Doketown. And a lot of it they acquired from Miramichi Salmon Club, which is still active today. And it's like the Boys Town Islands and stuff where they put in, and they'd fish by canoe down to here, and then the next day they'd go to Amos-town. And they did that in the spring of the year too with canoes, before the outboard motors. So it was a big expanse of water, and we would have, 25 guests at a time, lots of times.
Wow.
Yeah, and the ladies did all the cooking and all the planning, and they'd have shore lunches and stuff. And we continued that tradition with the shore lunches until, until the 1990s or even later maybe. I mean, we still have shore lunches today, but not with the open fire and stuff like we used to every day. They first started operating with the lap strake canoe. So that's the old canoe built with, they look like clapboards, what they look like.
Yeah.
And they would tar them. They would put tar in them.
Wow.
And we have pictures of the old lap strake canoes sitting in the beaver pond at the old homestead, floating to get the wood swelled up so they wouldn't leak quite as bad. So they did that, and then I don't know when the outboard motors started using them, but when I took over the business in '83 with my mother and my wife, and we had using outboard motors then. So it was a big business, a lot of people working. So we would start in April. We'd have 4 or 5 weeks of spring fishing. And I think in the 60s and 50s they had maybe more weeks, but we had about 4 weeks or 5 weeks. And then you'd have the trout fishing start in early May, and you'd fish the Cairns River and the Miramichi both. And then you'd start in June, just like we do now, and fish for the summer run, June, July. and part of August, you know, depending on the weather, of course.
Yeah.
And then you'd hit the fall run and fish till the season closed, first the end of September, I guess then. So we would fish 12 rods a day, and we would have when I was doing it, we would have three groups of four. So we'd have two canoes and a guide, or two guides and two canoes and four fishermen. We'd put in Ludlow, our boys down, and then the next crew would start in Miramichi, and then the third group would go to Carroll's Crossing. So we rotate 12 fishermen away.
Wow.
Around. So in 1990, we were fishing 12 rods a day for 20 weeks.
Wow.
About.
Wow.
And I remember in particular one year, Bonnie said, Keith, why don't we just try to take off a couple of days in August when it's slow? So I purposely blocked out my calendar, this was like 1990, 91, blocked out the calendar and didn't take any fishermen for 3 days. That was the big break. Because, you know, he was working 7 days a week. And, I mean, I use that term work kind of loosely because lots of people will ask me, say, you know, you work 7 days a week. And I said, well, I kind of don't work. I just, you know, get up in the morning, do chores, and do things that need to be done, you know, to make your day, make the place function. Because it's such a unique, in those days, it was such a unique part of who you were, like the river.
Yeah.
Like everything was based on the river. Like, I mean, I watched the weather intimately, and I watched it just, and I would lament about the weather, and you was constantly watching the temperature of the water and the rain, the wind, and oh my God, I wish it would rain, and oh my God, I wish it stopped raining, and I wish the water would come out, and then the next week you say, well, Lord, I wish the water dropped a little bit, if it would just level off. But I remember of course, my father died when I was 21, and he was only 49, so it was just me and my mother, and she was young, she was in her 40s, like, you know, my grandmother, Claire, was like 60s, you know, in her early 60s maybe. And so we were just, you know, thrust into this thing, had to run it all of a sudden. And I, like I was saying, I used to worry about the weather, and I'd go in every other day to talk to grandmother, and she lived right there. And I remember her advice, Keith, you can't control the weather. Like, you've heard the old saying, you can't, you know, don't cry over spilt milk. Well, like, once it's done, it's done. You can't, yeah, so she used to give me lots of advice, but that was a simple one. Like, the river come up 2 feet, well, don't whine about it. It's up 2 feet, you just have to, but you know, with being an outfitter and a guide, you want every guy that comes, every guest, every girl, lady, you want them to have the perfect trip. You know, I remember one time Lloyd Lyons was guiding for us, and he was doing a story with I'm not sure who it was, I think it's for the Salmon Journal, and he said to the guy, you know, he said the conditions are just too good. And the guy quoted him in the story that the conditions were too good, mind you. So, but what he meant that, you know, everything was perfect, the conditions were so good, the fish were just, you know, motoring on through, you know. This was in July when it was, you normally talking about the heat or you know, or something, that particular time we had really good, so the conditions were too good. So, you know, there's no other excuse with fly fishermen, you can always fall back on that one, it's just too good.